Thank you. So my name, like you said, is Necoline Hubner. I'm a software engineer at Google Fiber through a company called Adecco. And previous to working in tech, I actually worked in education, primarily working with building up education programs for adult refugees. So working in adult education is one of my favorite things. And if I can ever combine tech and ed together, it's like a perfect combination. So to start off, I'd like to tell you, bring you on a bit of a journey, if you will. I'm going to propose a scenario that I'd like you to also imagine. So imagine that you've got your dream job, this idea of where you want to be in 18 months or 2 years, and this position, this type of work that you want to do, and you actually get a chance to apply to this position way before you think that you're ready for it. And you think, you know, I might as well just go ahead and put in this application, see what happens. And you end up getting the job. So this job is a bit of a higher seniority level, maybe the tech stack is different, it's a different framework that you'll be using, but you have a few weeks before you start working, so you think, hey, like I'm a good student, I'm just gonna take these few weeks, I'm gonna prepare and be ready for this job when I start. So you start to do your homework, you start to do courses online, read blogs, attend meetups, and the more that you start reading these docs, the more you start building these test apps, the more you realize how much there is to learn and how much you don't know. And you start to feel a little overwhelmed. And so you keep trying to surround yourself with inspiration, you keep trying to bolster up your self-esteem, but you still feel this weight, this anxiety that you're going to start this new job and you may or you may not be able to do the work that you said that you're going to be able to do. So in a last-ditch effort, you grab coffee with a friend, you explain to them your pain points and what you're trying to learn and how frustrated you are, and they listen with an empathetic ear, and then they kind of sit back and they say, hey, don't worry. What you're going through is called the imposter syndrome. This is totally normal in our careers. Everyone goes through it at some point, and you're gonna get through it. Just remember who you are, remember everything that you've done in the past, and just feel better about yourself, and you'll make it through. So how many of you have at some point in your careers had a similar type of environment? And how many of you have been told about this imposter syndrome? And how many of you that have been told about this imposter syndrome have found this diagnosis to be helpful in any way? Okay, a few of you. So I myself have not found this to be helpful, which is why I wrote this talk. So the imposter syndrome, as we've come to know it in our community, is these thoughts or feelings of inadequacy or fraudulence, despite being fully capable of the task at hand. Now, the issue with this is that there's no root problem. There's nothing that we can actually address here because we're talking about symptoms rather than an issue itself. And we're all developers here, and we understand that if there's a problem and we don't have a root of that problem, we're not going to be able to find a lasting solution. So I've put together a different definition for imposter syndrome. And this is the psychological side effects of encountering new information in an environment of real or perceived high pressure. And that's really all it is. It's new information that you're encountering. And the good or bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that our careers are full of new information. There's always something new to be learned. There's a new framework coming out seemingly every year, new technologies, new libraries that we're constantly learning. So if the problem is new information, it would be logical to conclude that the answer would be to better understand the acquisition of information and thereby create a consistent roadmap in which you can acquire this in an effective manner. So today I'm going to split up this idea of what our knowledge base is into 4 categories. And talk about how these 4 categories can be implemented in ways that can help us on our career journeys. So we've got our known knowns, the things that we know that we know. We've got our unknown unknowns, things that we have no idea about, have not encountered it in our lives or in our careers. Our known unknowns, things that we know exist, but we don't know much about. So this could be things in marketing or design or back end, or things that we have on our to-do list that we want to learn, but we just don't have that ability, or we don't have that in our knowledge base. And then we have our unknown knowns. So these are things that I would call learning pathologies, things that we think that we know, but we don't actually know. So they present roadblocks for us in our journey to learn new things. So we'll start with the known knowns. We'll break this down into 3 different categories. The first is schema. So this is an academic term for basically our existing knowledge. This is what we do for work every day. We roll out of bed, we grab our coffee, we get to work, and we sit down and we look at this code base that ideally we understand, work in a framework that we're familiar with, use a language that we're quite fluent in to create new features and roll out new things on a consistent basis. This is our comfort zone. This is what makes us feel good about ourselves and makes us feel like we are who we say we are, essentially. And the important thing to note is this knowledge is yours forever. If you use a certain pattern, like an implementation pattern, like maybe currying, for example, and you know exactly when to use it, when not to use it, why one might use it, no one can ever take that away from you. That's not ever going to escape your memory or your knowledge just because you're standing in front of somebody that makes you feel intimidated or might give you like the imposter syndrome, so to speak. So this is stuff that you are quite comfortable with. And it's important because it provides context for what you're doing and contrast. You know when to apply something and when not to apply something because you understand how it works. The next one is our lexicon. This is our mental dictionary. These are the words that we use to describe the information that we have. And it's important to distinguish the difference between our knowledge base and the words that we use to describe our knowledge base. So we all know that that person who is a genius behind their computer or in their comfort zone, but if they stand up in front of people, you put them in an interview or maybe in front of a classroom, they can't convey that information. Maybe you've had a professor at school who you know is a genius, but you don't really understand what he's saying. On the opposite end, you might have a friend who is not a very good coder, but can convince you that he knows everything or she knows everything because they're very eloquent in the way that they talk about what they know and what they're doing. So for better or for worse, the words that we use to describe the information that we know is very important in conveying what we know and how we know it to other people. And this is important because we need to be able to ask questions. If we don't understand something, we need to use our words to tell people what it is that we're confused about, hopefully why we're confused about that, and how they can help us gain that answer. And you might have a full comprehension of what it is that you're working with and why you're confused, but you're struggling to find the words in which you can help someone understand where you're at. And this happens on all levels, but it's particularly important to people that are just starting because you can gain a concept of how something works and not know what terms to apply to it. And lastly, this is really important for collaboration. You might be able to write the most readable code and architect a wonderful design for your app, but if you can't sit down in a meeting and convey this information to your team, they're not going to be able to understand your vision and they're not going to know how to implement that on their own. So being able to use the correct terminology in a way that helps inform and inspire other people on how we're going to move forward on a topic is very important. And the last one is experience, or proof of knowledge. So you might read a blog, you might attend a conference and have an idea of what something is, but it's not until you actually sit down and code with it that you understand the limitations of your knowledge on that particular concept, as well as the limitations on that particular piece of technology. So experience really seals everything in together. Experience is also really important on understanding yourself. So you need to be able to know where you've been and where you are to know where you're going. So if you're thinking about going into management or you want to become a full stack developer or back end, you kind of have to know what front end is first or something to be able to know where you're going. And also you need to know how you learn. So you can't avoid burnout if you've never been burnt out. And you can't avoid a hostile work environment unless you've witnessed it. And hopefully you never have to, but it helps in identifying it and working through that. So all of these things are known knowns create the foundation for dynamic learning. And this is quite apparent if you have extensive experience in technology. All of your technologies work to help you understand new technologies that you're going to learn. But this also applies to other knowledge bases. If you don't come from tech, if you don't have a CS background, this all still bolsters your ability to learn new things in the future. So that's pretty observational, and I want to move on to these learning malpractices, which is our unknown knowns. So these are things that we think we know, but we don't know. So it's an inability to see our own limitations. So we all have boundaries on our knowledge base. It's just a fact. There are things that we don't know. And the way that we operate with these boundaries of our knowledge base is paramount in how we grow. So if we're always trying to figure out what that limit is to our understanding, we're always trying to push up against that and expand our knowledge and dig into the finite nuances of what we're working with, then we're constantly going to be able to grow and evolve in our careers. However, if you don't do that, if you start to feel comfortable in the way that you code and you stop questioning why you might do something the way you do it, or if there's a better way to have to come up with a solution, those walls or those boundaries can become walls, and they can become actors in keeping you enclosed in where you are and halting your growth as a developer. Now, this is really important because it's helpful to identify this in yourself and being able to push yourself to be able to reach those career aspirations that you hold for yourself and knowing how you can push against those boundaries to be able to grow and develop. But it's also important because the way you interact with information affects the environment around you. So if you don't welcome questions or scrutiny into the ways that things exist in your code base or the way things work at work, then it makes it difficult for other people to ask questions and maybe be self-reflective of their own practices. So if you are a junior developer or you have any sort of senior developers that create this level of insecurity in yourself, that you don't feel like you can ask a question, it can be helpful to identify that this might be what's happening, that there might be a bit of unknown knowns going on that you can identify and work around. So in other words, it might not be you, it might be them, right? So because this is something that's happening internally, where these boundaries of our knowledge base are somewhat invisible, I've put together some symptoms that we can look for, and hopefully in ourselves, and maybe we can acknowledge in other people if that's the case. These symptoms include a lack of curiosity, an inability to acknowledge mistakes or merits of either practices or methods, and a resistance to change generally. And the causes can be false perceptions of known knowns. You think you understand something, but you understand it incorrectly, or you're just not interested in the known unknowns. You're not interested in being able to find that next thing that can help you become a better developer. And so since we've identified this lack of growth, the question is, how do we actually acquire new information? And this is where we bring up the unknown or the known unknowns, these things that we're acquiring in our knowledge base. So we are running into these things all the time. Finding and identifying a known unknown is not very difficult. This comes up all the time at work. Anytime you run into any sort of problem, you get online, you try to figure out what library or piece of technology or anything that you can use to solve this problem, and you can identify something that you might need to learn. We follow thought leaders on Twitter, come to conferences, get a lot of new ideas. And we also have personal passions. We think of problems that we'd like to solve, and we find tools that we can acquire in that process. What's important to note here is that everyone's schematic map looks a little bit different. If you have a lot of experience, if you know a lot of technologies, everything starts to look a lot like everything else. And so acquiring new information is quite easy because you can say, hey, this one thing is very similar to this other thing, and I'm just going to plug it in here because this is the use case for it. However, if you're starting out, you have a lot of building up to do. So take this example of JavaScript, React, and Redux. If you are very eloquent, you're very fluent in JavaScript, and you've worked in React, then trying to acquire something like Redux simply becomes a matter of understanding the difference between traditional state management and using a store. And so you have a question of when you implement what and how you get it set up. And that's kind of it. But if your JavaScript is not that good and you're learning React at the same time that you're learning Redux, there's a lot of information that you have to acquire in order to be able to use Redux effectively. So when you're trying to learn something that seems enormous, you should consider this principle that's quite basic in the world of teaching called I+1. And the I is your knowledge base. It is what you understand that is at the foundation of what you're trying to learn. And as kids, we're like sponges. We can absorb a lot of information all at the same time. But as adults, we have to systematize how we learn. And we have to be able to limit the things that we're learning so we can internalize it accordingly. So our brains can only really take in one new piece of information at a time. So we have to acknowledge that and allow that to be our practice. So you first have to identify what it is that you know that applies to what you're trying to learn. So what about React do you understand? What about JavaScript do you feel comfortable using? And add one thing on top of that and turn that thing into a known. So identify it, learn about it, learn how to speak about it, and gain some experience using it. And then once that's yours, once it's internalized, that becomes your I, and then you add one more thing on top of it. So if you take that one thing and you add it on top of the next thing, you're continually growing, a few things are happening. So one, you're going to have full confidence that you're going to get to the end of this roadmap because it is a roadmap, and you're not going to ever doubt your ability to learn something because you're doing it in a way that you feel like you're able to apply everything that you're acquiring. So lastly, we've got our unknown unknowns. So these are things that are the new technologies that are hiding around every corner, seemingly, in our lives as developers. And this can be anxiety-inducing if you worry about the learning process, if you don't have confidence in your ability to take on all this information, or it can be exciting depending on how you understand how you're going to get there. So we've got, so once we've identified our unknown unknowns, it becomes a known unknown. So here we've got our JavaScript and CSS, and I've put together this library, not put together, but filled this in, and this is Radium. How many of you have heard of Radium? One? Well, it's a great library, and the rest of you who don't know, there's your known unknown for the day, and I encourage you to check it out if that's interesting to you, but it's made by Formidable Labs, which I find to be a really great resource for things. So that's really it. That's the whole process. These are all of the 4 categories of your knowledge base. So the learning process is essential because we're always asking questions. We're always pushing up against problems at work, and we need to be able to find answers to those problems. Secondly, collaboration is everything. We need to be able to work with people. We need to be able to grow as a team, and allowing and putting together a methodology in which you can implement a learning process for yourself as well as for your team allows the whole team to move quickly through a problem. And lastly, we get to avoid unintended consequences. So no one wants to be the person that makes someone else afraid to ask a question. And you don't want to be on a team where you don't know what somebody doesn't know. You want them to be able to surface that and then clarify it so then they can be productive. So if we can understand how this works, then we can navigate around it and not be the unknown known guy. So I'll just skip this, but in interest of time. But the whole idea is that learning is an iterative process, that we need to identify, I'll just go back to it. Identify, solve, share, and improve the process of learning. And if you went through a process, you didn't do it well, you thought you skipped over a few steps, then you just get to do it again and again because we have endless opportunities to learn new things. So in summary, the imposter syndrome is basically an invitation to cultivate a culture of learning. We get to build our own learning process. We have to know ourselves. We have to know how we learn in order to be able to answer these questions. But it's important to acknowledge it for the whole process that it really is. And once you start building these roadmaps for yourself, start to think about other people's experiences, because everyone's learning something, and there's so many people that are learning something from the scratch. They've got a lot of things that they're trying to learn at once, and helping them to understand that they're on this long journey and they can make it, and that they are capable of acquiring all this information is really important to helping them feel comfortable in their environment. And if you can get everyone to show up fully as themselves and ask questions and grow and learn, they're going to be able to be developers or better developers and write better code, and essentially that's going to create a better web for everybody. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thanks. It's really interesting. So we have a question on the Slido here, which goes like, as a product owner, I sometimes encounter a lack of curiosity in my developer colleagues. How might I inspire them to be more experimental, at least occasionally?
That's a great question. I think inspiring people to be curious takes a bit of example. If you're not sure how to get them curious, try to be curious yourself about what they're trying to do, or what you're trying to do, what they're trying to do. And a lot of people don't know that it's okay to ask questions. Sometimes people feel like it's a sign of like being stupid, like if they ask a question and they're not as smart as they want people to think that they are. So maybe take the first step and be open about asking questions, and that can go a long way. So
lead by example, essentially. There's another one incoming in the meantime while you're typing. I read a really interesting article about imposter syndrome in women and how it affects women like loads more than men. And it might contribute to the gender pay gap as well. So I couldn't find it. I was looking it up, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really interesting information about what the imposter syndrome is, who experiences it, and I think there's a lot at play there, especially with gender dynamics. There's a lot of reasons, I think, for that. The women, when they're together, they're quite collaborative by nature, and if they feel like they're in a competitive environment, sometimes it leaves you at a loss of how to move forward and how to find your own answers in that environment where you don't know where to reach for help. And that's a tough one. And I think the kind of like the answer to before is just take the first step for yourself, but it's not easy. And if the environment that you're in is makes it difficult to ask questions, try to work through it. But honestly, there's a lot of wonderful environments where you can ask questions and find good mentors, and just try to find yourself in a good place. Yeah.
Okay, we just got one last question that we're going to ask before lunch. So this one says, I'm getting older and I can't learn as fast as younger developers. Any suggestions? Should I limit what I learn?
No. And it's true that when you're younger, you can absorb more information, but it's not true that there is a myth that older people can't learn as much. And I would just go back to the slide of the known knowns and remember that you've got a full knowledge base, much more full than people that are younger than you, and trying to dig into what it is that you know that's similar to what you're trying to learn can be really important for building confidence, which I think is one of the biggest steps as older learners.
Actually, we've got one more minute, so there's two questions which are actually very similar, along the lines of, first one says, I've just started coding and sometimes it feels a bit too much. What's the best way to go around this? And the second one, which is similar, it says, with the increasing amount of tools and new technologies, how do you cope with the continuous feeling of being an imposter, although you're learning a ton of things? So I feel like they're quite similar.
Yeah, you can do it. I'm quite my pep talk. You can do it. It's a lot. But to the new developer and to the other question, there is a certain basis. There's certain fundamentals that you learn, and once you understand what those building blocks are, there's a certain number of complex concepts when it comes to frameworks. So once you understand those, then it doesn't really matter which framework you're applying it to. So know that even though the information is vast, establish the baseline, and you'll start to realize that you can find footing in some of those areas. And also find a mentor. Find a safe place where you can just bring what you might think is a dumb coding question, because it rarely is. They can be quite complex. So just find somebody that will sit you down and explain something to you. And also to the person who has a lot of new technologies coming at them, find a mentor who kind of knows what's going on and say, hey, this is important to pay attention to. This is only really interesting if you're working in this sector, and they can kind of help you navigate that.
Good stuff. Now, I think I pronounced your name incorrectly at the beginning.
No worries, it's hard. It's Necoline Hubner.
Necoline Hubner. So I did it wrong again, didn't I?
No worries.
It's up there.
Yeah.
It's up there.
Yeah.
Go follow her. But let's give her a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you.